What you're about to hear is a tale so terrifying, so steeped in maritime horror and supernatural dread, that it has haunted the docks and warehouses of New Orleans for over a century. This is not merely a story of workers who encountered a mysterious vessel or fell victim to an industrial accident. This is the documented account of 31 of the strongest and most experienced dock workers in the Crescent City who were hired to load cargo onto a ship that should never have been allowed to dock, and the 8 survivors whose testimonies would forever change how the people of New Orleans understood the thin line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This is the true story of the Perdition's Anchor, where honest labor became a gateway to hell itself. The year was 1895, and the port of New Orleans was experiencing one of the most prosperous periods in its history. The mighty Mississippi River served as America's great commercial highway, carrying goods from the heartland to the Gulf of Mexico and connecting the interior of the continent to the markets of the world. The docks that lined the river were a constant hive of activity, where thousands of workers labored day and night to load and unload the endless stream of vessels that brought prosperity to the Crescent City. Among the most skilled and reliable workers on the New Orleans waterfront were the members of the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 1419, a brotherhood of dock workers whose strength, endurance, and expertise made them the backbone of the port's operations. These men could load a steamship faster and more efficiently than any other crew on the river, and their reputation for reliability had made them the preferred choice for the most important and lucrative cargo operations. The 31 men who would board the Perdition's Anchor on that fateful October morning represented the cream of New Orleans' dock working community. They were led by Big Jim Thibodeau, a Cajun giant whose 6'8" frame and massive hands could single-handedly move cargo that would normally require 2 or 3 men. Big Jim had worked the docks for over 20 years, and his knowledge of ships, cargo handling, and the treacherous currents of the Mississippi made him an invaluable foreman for the most challenging loading operations. Among his crew was Samuel "Iron Sam" Washington, a former slave whose freedom had come with the end of the Civil War but whose real liberation had come through his mastery of dock work. Iron Sam could lift and carry loads that seemed impossible for a man of his size, and his understanding of leverage, balance, and teamwork had made him one of the most respected workers on the waterfront. His leadership among the African American dock workers was unquestioned, and his presence on any crew guaranteed both efficiency and safety. The team also included Paddy O'Brien, an Irish immigrant whose family had fled the potato famine and found new life in America through hard work. On the docks, Paddy's quick wit and natural leadership abilities had made him a favorite among both workers and supervisors, and his ability to organize complex loading operations had earned him a reputation as one of the finest cargo masters on the river. From the German community came Klaus Zimmermann, whose engineering background had given him an understanding of ship construction and cargo distribution that was invaluable when loading heavy or dangerous materials. Klaus's methodical approach and attention to detail had prevented numerous accidents over the years, and his presence on a crew was considered a guarantee of both safety and efficiency. The remaining 27 men represented the multicultural nature of New Orleans' dock working community. Creoles whose families had worked the river for generations, Italians who had brought Mediterranean seafaring traditions to the Mississippi, Scandinavians whose knowledge of northern shipping methods had proven valuable in southern waters, and native-born Americans who had learned their trade through years of hard experience on the waterfront. The job that would bring these 31 men together came through the usual channels: a shipping agent representing a vessel that needed to be loaded quickly and efficiently for departure on the evening tide. The pay was exceptional, nearly double the normal rate for dock work, and the cargo was described as specialty goods requiring experienced handling. The urgency of the job and the premium pay rate made it an attractive opportunity for workers who were always looking to maximize their earnings during the busy shipping season. The shipping agent who hired the crew was a man named Cornelius Blackwood, whose pale complexion and formal manner of dress set him apart from the rough-and-tumble world of the waterfront. Blackwood claimed to represent European interests that required discretion and efficiency in their shipping operations, and his willingness to pay premium rates without haggling suggested that money was no object for his employers. What the dock workers didn't know was that the Perdition's Anchor had a history that stretched back over 2 centuries, a dark legacy of death and supernatural horror that had followed the vessel through multiple owners, numerous name changes, and countless voyages to ports around the world. The ship had been built in 1693 in the shipyards of Salem, Massachusetts, during the height of the witch trials, and local legend claimed that its timbers had been cursed by one of the accused witches as she was led to her execution. The vessel's original name had been the Covenant's Promise, and it had been commissioned by a group of Puritan merchants who intended to use it for trade with the Caribbean colonies. But the ship's maiden voyage had ended in disaster when the entire crew had been found dead in their bunks, apparently killed by some unknown plague that left no visible symptoms. The cargo had been intact, the ship had suffered no damage, but every man aboard had died during a single night at sea. Over the following decades, the ship had changed hands numerous times, with each new owner attempting to break what seemed to be a curse that followed the vessel wherever it sailed. The ship had been renamed repeatedly, the Redemption's Hope, the New Covenant, the Blessed Mercy, but no change of identity could alter its fundamental nature. Crews continued to die under mysterious circumstances, cargo would disappear without explanation, and ports began to refuse entry to the vessel as its reputation for supernatural horror spread throughout the maritime community. By 1895, the ship had acquired its current name, the Perdition's Anchor, from a captain who had embraced rather than fought its dark reputation. Captain Ezekiel Morrigan was a man whose own history was shrouded in mystery and whose methods of maintaining discipline aboard his vessel were whispered about in waterfront taverns from Boston to New Orleans. Some claimed he had made a bargain with supernatural forces to ensure his ship's profitability, while others suggested that he himself was no longer entirely human. The Perdition's Anchor arrived in New Orleans on the morning of October 13, 1895, emerging from the pre-dawn fog like a specter from another age. The ship was a three-masted merchant vessel of unusual design, with lines that seemed to blend elements from different historical periods in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. Her black hull gleamed with a finish that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and her sails, when furled, appeared to be made of material that was darker than any canvas the dock workers had ever seen. The vessel docked at Pier 19, one of the more isolated berths on the New Orleans waterfront, away from the main commercial traffic that characterized the busier sections of the port. This location had been specifically requested by the shipping agent, who claimed that the cargo required privacy and security that could not be guaranteed at the more public docks. The pier itself had a reputation among dock workers as an unlucky location where accidents seemed to happen more frequently than elsewhere on the waterfront. When the 31 dock workers arrived at Pier 19 that morning, they found the Perdition's Anchor waiting for them like a black monument to maritime power. The ship's crew was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual for a loading operation, as ship's crews typically assisted with cargo handling to ensure that their vessel was properly loaded and balanced. The only figure visible on deck was Captain Morrigan himself, a tall, gaunt man whose pale skin and dark eyes gave him an almost corpse-like appearance. Captain Morrigan greeted the dock workers with a courtesy that seemed forced and unnatural, his voice carrying an accent that none of them could identify but that seemed to belong to no particular region or time period. He explained that his crew was resting after a difficult voyage and would not be available to assist with the loading operation, but he assured the workers that the cargo was clearly marked and that the ship's holds were prepared to receive it. The cargo itself was stored in a warehouse adjacent to Pier 19, and when the dock workers entered the building to begin their work, they found themselves confronted with crates and containers unlike anything they had ever encountered. The wooden boxes were made from timber that appeared to be centuries old, bound with iron straps that had been forged using techniques that seemed to predate modern metallurgy. The containers bore markings in languages that none of the workers could read, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Big Jim Thibodeau, whose experience with cargo handling was extensive, immediately noticed that something was wrong with the weight distribution of the containers. Boxes that appeared to be identical in size and construction varied wildly in weight, with some being so light they seemed almost empty while others were so heavy that they required the combined strength of several men to move. The inconsistency made it difficult to plan the loading operation efficiently and created safety hazards that experienced dock workers would normally have anticipated and avoided. Iron Sam Washington was troubled by the temperature variations he noticed when handling different containers. Some of the crates were cold to the touch, so cold that they seemed to draw heat from his hands and leave his fingers numb and aching. Others were warm, almost hot, despite having been stored in the same warehouse under identical conditions. The temperature differences seemed to have no relationship to the contents or the materials from which the containers were constructed. As the loading operation began, the dock workers started to notice other disturbing phenomena that set this job apart from any they had previously undertaken. The cargo seemed to resist being moved, not through weight or awkward dimensions, but through some kind of supernatural reluctance that made even the simplest tasks more difficult than they should have been. Ropes would tangle without cause. Pulleys would jam for no apparent reason, and the workers found themselves making mistakes that their years of experience should have prevented. Paddy O'Brien, whose Irish heritage had given him a healthy respect for supernatural phenomena, was the first to voice concerns about the nature of their cargo. He pointed out that some of the containers seemed to emit sounds when moved, not the normal creaking and settling that might be expected from wooden crates, but sounds that resembled whispers, moans, or even what might have been muffled screams. His fellow workers initially dismissed these observations as imagination or the normal sounds of cargo shifting, but as the morning progressed, more of them began to notice the disturbing audio phenomena. Klaus Zimmermann's engineering background made him particularly sensitive to the structural anomalies he observed in the ship's construction. The Perdition's anchor appeared to have been modified numerous times over its long history, with additions and alterations that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Some of the ship's internal spaces were larger than should have been possible given the vessel's external dimensions, while others were cramped and confined in ways that defied logical design principles. As the loading operation continued into the afternoon, the dock workers began to experience physical and psychological effects that they had never encountered during previous jobs. Several men reported feeling dizzy and disoriented, as if the ship itself was somehow affecting their sense of balance and spatial orientation. Others complained of headaches and nausea that seemed to worsen the longer they remained aboard the vessel. The most disturbing development was the gradual realization that the ship's crew, which Captain Morgan had claimed was resting below decks, was nowhere to be found. Workers who ventured into the lower levels of the ship in search of assistance or information found empty quarters that showed no signs of recent habitation. The crew's personal effects were absent, their bunks were unmade, and the galley showed no evidence of recent meal preparation. It was as if the ship had been sailing itself across the Gulf of Mexico without any human crew whatsoever. As the sun began to set over New Orleans, the loading operation was nearing completion, but the dock workers were becoming increasingly anxious to finish their work and leave the Perdition's anchor. The atmosphere aboard the ship had grown more oppressive as the day progressed, and several workers reported seeing figures moving in their peripheral vision, shadowy forms that vanished whenever they tried to look directly at them. Big Jim Thibodeau, whose leadership responsibilities made him reluctant to abandon a job before completion, began to notice that some of his crew members were acting strangely. Men who had worked together for years were becoming suspicious and hostile toward each other, and minor disagreements were escalating into serious conflicts. The camaraderie that normally characterized dock work crews was being replaced by an atmosphere of mistrust and fear that seemed to emanate from the ship itself. It was as darkness fell over the port that the true horror of their situation began to reveal itself. The final containers to be loaded were stored in the deepest part of the warehouse, in a section that had been kept locked until the last moment. When the shipping agent finally provided the key to this area, the dock workers found themselves confronted with cargo that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The containers in the locked section were not made of wood and iron like the others, but appeared to be constructed from materials that defied identification. Some seemed to be carved from single pieces of black stone, while others appeared to be made from metal alloys that had properties unlike any known materials. The markings on these containers were more elaborate and disturbing than those on the earlier cargo, featuring symbols that seemed to move and writhe when observed directly. But it was the sounds emanating from these final containers that truly terrified the dock workers. Unlike the whispers and moans they had heard from the earlier cargo, these containers produced sounds that were unmistakably human, voices calling for help, screaming in agony, and pleading for release. The sounds were muffled but clearly audible, and they seemed to come from within the sealed containers themselves. Iron Sam Washington, whose courage had never been questioned during his years on the waterfront, refused to handle the containers that were producing human voices. He declared that no amount of money was worth participating in what appeared to be human trafficking or worse, and he began to organize a work stoppage among the other dock workers. His moral stand was supported by several of his colleagues, but others argued that they were contractually obligated to complete the loading operation regardless of their personal concerns. The debate among the workers was interrupted by the appearance of Captain Morgan, who had been absent from the deck during most of the loading operation. The captain's appearance had changed dramatically since the morning. His pale skin had taken on a grayish hue, his dark eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and his movements had become fluid and unnatural in a way that suggested he was no longer entirely human. Captain Morgan explained that the sounds coming from the containers were not human voices but rather the effects of atmospheric pressure changes on the cargo contents. He assured the workers that they were not participating in any illegal activity and that their concerns were based on misunderstandings of natural phenomena. His explanation was delivered in a voice that carried hypnotic qualities, and several of the dock workers found themselves accepting his assurances despite their earlier reservations. But as the final containers were loaded into the ship's deepest hold, the supernatural nature of the cargo became impossible to deny. The containers that had been producing human voices began to emit a phosphorescent glow that illuminated the hold with an eerie green light. The temperature in the cargo area dropped dramatically, causing the workers' breath to become visible in the suddenly frigid air. Most disturbing of all, the voices from within the containers became clearer and more distinct, revealing themselves to be the pleas of souls trapped in some form of supernatural imprisonment. It was at this moment that the dock workers realized they were not simply loading cargo onto a merchant vessel, but were participating in the transportation of human souls that had been captured and imprisoned by supernatural forces. The Perdition's anchor was not a conventional ship but a vessel that traveled between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, carrying its cargo of trapped souls to destinations that existed beyond normal human understanding. The revelation of the ship's true nature triggered a panic among the dock workers, but their attempts to flee were thwarted by supernatural forces that had been building throughout the day. The ship's gangway had disappeared, trapping them aboard the vessel, and the dock itself seemed to have been cut off from the rest of the port by an impenetrable wall of fog that had appeared without warning. Captain Morgan, no longer bothering to maintain his human facade, revealed himself to be a supernatural entity whose purpose was to collect souls for transport to realms beyond the physical world. The loading operation had been a trap designed to capture the life force and spiritual essence of the dock workers, adding them to the cargo of imprisoned souls that the ship carried on its eternal voyage between worlds. One by one, the dock workers began to succumb to the supernatural forces that permeated the ship. Their bodies remained functional, continuing to move cargo and perform their assigned tasks, but their souls were being extracted and imprisoned in the same type of containers they had been loading throughout the day. The process was gradual and insidious, allowing the entity to savor the terror and desperation of its victims while slowly draining away their humanity. Big Jim Thibodeau, whose physical strength had always been his greatest asset, found that his size and power were useless against supernatural forces that operated outside the normal rules of physics. His attempts to break through the barriers that trapped them aboard the ship were futile, and he watched in horror as his crew members were reduced to soulless automatons who continued their work with mechanical precision but no human awareness. Iron Sam Washington's moral courage, which had led him to resist the loading of the final containers, seemed to provide some protection against the entity's influence. His refusal to participate in what he recognized as evil gave him a spiritual strength that the supernatural forces found difficult to overcome. However, he was powerless to help his colleagues who had not shared his moral clarity and were now being consumed by the entity's hunger. Paddy O'Brien's Irish heritage had given him some knowledge of supernatural phenomena, and he attempted to use traditional protective prayers and rituals to shield himself and his remaining colleagues from the entity's influence. His efforts provided temporary relief, but the supernatural forces aboard the ship were too powerful to be permanently deterred by conventional spiritual defenses. Klaus Zimmermann's analytical mind allowed him to understand the mechanical aspects of the supernatural trap they had fallen into, but his engineering knowledge was useless against forces that operated outside the laws of physics. He could see how the entity was manipulating reality to achieve its goals, but he lacked the spiritual tools necessary to counter its influence. As the night progressed and more dock workers fell victim to the entity's hunger, the 8 survivors, Big Jim Thibodeau, Iron Sam Washington, Paddy O'Brien, Klaus Zimmermann, and 4 others whose moral clarity or spiritual strength had provided some protection, found themselves huddled together in the ship's forward hold, desperately seeking a way to escape their supernatural prison. The entity, satisfied with its harvest of 23 souls but not yet ready to complete its collection, revealed to the 8 survivors that they had been spared for a specific purpose. They were to return to the New Orleans waterfront and spread word of the lucrative cargo handling opportunities that could be found by working with certain shipping agents. Their survival was not an act of mercy but a calculated investment in the entity's long-term strategy for harvesting human souls. As dawn approached, the supernatural fog that had isolated the ship began to dissipate, and the normal sounds of port activity gradually returned to the waterfront. The Perdition's anchor prepared to depart with its cargo of imprisoned souls. But the 8 survivors found that they were now able to leave the vessel. The gangway had reappeared, and the barriers that had trapped them throughout the night had been removed. The 8 men who stumbled off the Perdition's anchor in the early morning light were forever changed by their encounter with supernatural evil. They had witnessed the consumption of their colleagues' souls, had seen the true nature of forces that existed beyond human understanding, and had been marked by their exposure to the entity's influence in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Big Jim Thibodeau never worked the docks again after his experience aboard the Perdition's anchor. The giant Cajun who had once been the strongest man on the waterfront found that his encounter with supernatural forces had left him with a deep understanding of human vulnerability that made it impossible for him to maintain his previous confidence. He became a fisherman, working alone on the Gulf waters where he felt safer from the supernatural forces that he now knew lurked in the world of commerce and industry. Iron Sam Washington's moral courage, which had provided some protection against the entity's influence, led him to become a preacher who warned dock workers and other laborers about the spiritual dangers that could accompany certain types of work. His sermons often included veiled references to his experience aboard the Perdition's anchor, though he was careful never to provide enough detail to be dismissed as a madman. Paddy O'Brien returned to Ireland within a year of the incident, claiming that America had become too dangerous for honest working men. His family reported that he was never the same after his return, spending long hours staring out at the Atlantic Ocean as if he was watching for something that only he could see. He died in his sleep in 1903, and his last words were reported to be a warning about ships that sailed in fog. Klaus Zimmermann used his engineering knowledge to develop new safety protocols for dock workers, though he was never able to explain the supernatural basis for many of his recommendations. His innovations in cargo handling equipment included features designed to detect temperature anomalies and unusual weight distributions, though he never revealed that these features were intended to identify potentially supernatural cargo. The 4 other survivors scattered to different parts of the country, seeking to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the New Orleans waterfront. They maintained contact with each other through letters, providing mutual support and validation for their shared experience, but none of them ever returned to dock work or any other occupation that might bring them into contact with mysterious shipping operations. The 23 dock workers who had been consumed by the entity aboard the Perdition's anchor were never seen again, though their disappearance was officially attributed to a mass desertion rather than supernatural causes. The shipping agent who had hired them, Cornelius Blackwood, vanished along with the ship, leaving no trace of his identity or his employers. The cargo operation was recorded in port records as a routine commercial transaction, with no mention of the supernatural events that had occurred. The Perdition's anchor itself disappeared from New Orleans waters before dawn on October 14, 1895, and was never seen again in the port. However, reports of similar vessels appearing at other ports around the world continue to circulate in maritime circles, suggesting that the entity continued its harvest of human souls in different locations under different names. The incident had lasting effects on the New Orleans dock working community, though the full truth of what had happened was never widely known. Workers became more cautious about accepting jobs from unknown shipping agents, and informal networks developed to share information about suspicious cargo operations. The International Longshoremen's Association implemented new safety protocols that included provisions for workers to refuse jobs that seemed potentially dangerous, though these provisions were officially justified on practical rather than supernatural grounds. The warehouse adjacent to Pier 19, where the supernatural cargo had been stored, was abandoned after the incident and eventually demolished. Workers who had been assigned to clean out the building reported finding evidence of the containers that had held imprisoned souls, including scorch marks on the floor and walls that seemed to form patterns resembling human figures. The pier itself was avoided by dock workers whenever possible, and it eventually fell into disuse as commercial traffic was redirected to other facilities. The story of the Perdition's anchor became part of the oral tradition of the New Orleans waterfront, Passed down through generations of dock workers as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding the true nature of any cargo operation before accepting employment. The tale served both as entertainment and as a warning, reminding listeners that some jobs came with prices that no amount of money could justify. Modern researchers have attempted to investigate the Perdition's anchor incident using contemporary historical and paranormal investigation techniques, but their efforts have been hampered by the deliberate destruction of records and the passage of time. Port authorities of the 1890s were notoriously lax in their record-keeping, particularly for operations that involved unusual or sensitive cargo, and many documents from this period have been lost or destroyed. The psychological profiles of the 8 survivors have been studied by researchers interested in trauma and its effects on working-class communities. All 8 men exhibited symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but they also demonstrated enhanced spiritual awareness and sensitivity to supernatural phenomena that seemed to be connected to their experience aboard the ship. The incident has influenced the development of modern maritime safety protocols. Though the supernatural aspects of the case are not officially acknowledged, many of the safety procedures that are now standard in port operations can be traced back to innovations developed by Klaus Zimmermann and other survivors of supernatural maritime incidents, though the true origins of these protocols are not widely known. The case has also attracted the attention of researchers studying the history of human trafficking and forced labor, though the supernatural elements of the story complicate efforts to understand it within conventional historical frameworks. The transportation of imprisoned souls represents a form of human exploitation that exists outside normal legal and moral categories, challenging researchers to develop new conceptual tools for understanding supernatural crimes. The influence of the Perdition's anchor incident on maritime folklore extends far beyond New Orleans, with similar stories of ghost ships and supernatural cargo operations appearing in the oral traditions of port communities around the world. These tales serve to preserve knowledge of supernatural dangers that conventional authorities are unwilling or unable to acknowledge, providing informal protection for workers who might otherwise fall victim to similar traps. The 8 survivors' later lives were marked by their shared experience and the knowledge that they carried about the supernatural forces that could infiltrate the world of honest labor. They served as informal guardians of the dock working community, watching for signs that other workers might be falling under supernatural influence and providing warnings when suspicious cargo operations appeared on the waterfront. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey into the supernatural depths of maritime horror, we are left with questions that challenge our understanding of the forces that can infiltrate even the most mundane aspects of human labor. What really happened to those 23 dock workers who vanished without a trace aboard the Perdition's anchor? Was the entity that called itself Captain Morgan a supernatural predator that fed on human souls, or was it something even more sinister, a force that existed at the intersection of honest work and cosmic evil? The 8 survivors took their secrets to their graves, but their warnings remain as a testament to the importance of understanding the true nature of any work we undertake. In the busy ports and commercial centers where honest labor meets global commerce, some cargo comes with prices that no worker should ever be asked to pay, and some ships sail to destinations that exist beyond the boundaries of the living world. The fog that concealed the Perdition's anchor may have lifted with the dawn, but the legend lives on in the whispered stories of those who know that some jobs are too dangerous to accept, regardless of the pay they offer, for in the end, when we sell our labor to forces we don't understand, we may find that we have traded away more than our time and effort. We may have traded away our very souls. If this chilling tale of supernatural maritime horror and the price of honest labor has left you questioning what forces might be lurking behind seemingly legitimate business opportunities, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to uncover these forgotten chapters of working-class history that remind us why some jobs come with hidden costs that no amount of money can justify. And if you haven't already joined our community of truth seekers here at Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We delve deep into the shadows of history every week, bringing you stories that mainstream sources often overlook or dismiss. From the haunted waterfront of New Orleans to the dark corners of human labor and exploitation, we explore the mysteries that shaped our working world. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are often inspired by real events and genuine human experiences that deserve to be remembered and understood. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, keep questioning the official narratives, keep seeking the truth behind the legends, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous work is that which promises the greatest rewards without explaining the true nature of what we're being asked to do. This has been Bayou Nightmares, where the past never truly dies, and the darkest secrets eventually find their way to the light.